Hi, and welcome to Q's workshop. Today we are finally getting to assemble the WigWag engine. So full disclosure, I've already done all this already in a previous video. Unfortunately, the audio was terrible, and I thought, let me rather just re-record everything. I've got a new camera, I've got a lapel mic now, so I'm hoping that this is going to be a lot better. I'm sure it's going to be. I just ask you to bear with me a little bit while I work out some of the settings on the camera and kind of get it looking good. Right, let's get into the WigWag assembly. So firstly, Ade does run through the actual assembly. So I guess the very first thing I would say, follow the assembly notes. There is some key little bits in here that does make the assembly easier, but also the end result is going to be a lot better by following certain pieces in here. All right, so I'm going to run through some of the pieces that I didn't do correctly and the results of that, and then also what I did to fix it. But yeah, let's get into that. All right, so let's start at number one, which is kind of just shaping the column. So that's just really cutting this out, filing it to look good. First up in the assembly would be the bearings and pressing the bearings in. So that went quite easy because I created little tapers on the front ends of the bearings. So I had little lead-in edges on the bearings. So let's say the first 2 millimeters kind of slips in nice and easily. I put some oil in and then just pressed it in as the build note suggests. Another thing, this front piece that pops out on the cylinder side, Ade advises that it's going to be about 2 millimeters, but this does need to be adjusted. So this becomes a riding surface for your crank disc. So it might be that you have to bring it out a bit more or push it in a bit more, depending on any dimensions that you may have missed on your cylinder face. All right. Next up is, so your port and cylinder faces, they need to be super smooth because ultimately those two surfaces ride against one another. So you want those two surfaces to be smooth. I used some 5000 grit wet dry sandpaper on those two surfaces. So you just use a figure 8. Just to make sure that you don't mess up any of the dimensions. So that figure 8 pattern definitely helps. And then you get a nice smooth finish on those. All right, one of the probably the most key pieces is step 4. And I struggled with kind of this piece after my first assembly. So as Ade recommends, when inserting the pivot pin into the cylinder, drop some thread lock in and then actually mount it into the column. All right, and then put the spring on, put a little bit of tension on it and let it dry like this. And my take on that is you might have a slight deviation on the angle that your hole was drilled for your bearing or the hole in the bearing. So your hole might not be 100% perpendicular to the column or to the pin that comes out of the cylinder, but what this does by actually installing it and letting it dry like this is it transfers that same inaccuracy that you may have in your column and your bearing. It transfers that inaccuracy now into your pivot pin. So once it's dry and you actually take your pivot pin out, whatever that degrees is that it's a little bit off is the same degrees that your bearing is off to the face. All right, and that's a key piece. So I had to remove my pivot pin and reinstall it like that, because what I first did, I just dropped some thread seal in, I screwed the pivot pin in, and I left it one side to dry. What that did is that deviation of the angle now on that pivot pin wasn't the same as my bearing. So when I installed it, it was standing skew. This top corner was pressing against my column, but the rest of the face was away from the surface. So there wasn't a seal on that surface. I tried to fix it up. It didn't work properly. This top corner kept on binding into the column because that piece was, there was really a lot of pressure being put there for everything else to run flush. All right, so key piece of information is definitely that step 4. All right. So going into step 5, another piece that kind of got me was my crank disc, the hole in the center hole in the crank disc for the axle or crankshaft. My hole was not perpendicular to the surface. Whether it was because I drilled it skew or I messed it up while trying to ream it. So I did the reaming in my vise by hand, and I could have messed the hole up. But that hole was not perpendicular. And because of that, when it was installed, the actual crank disc was wobbling. So if I installed that, when I spinned it like this, you could actually see the crank disc going like that. And because of that, the crank pin would move up and down. All right. So, and I don't mean up and down as it should be, but for instance, this front point of the pin would go up and down like that. And what happens with it doing that is it binds into the crank connector. So for me, a key piece was, because that hole wasn't perpendicular to the surface, it had a whole bunch of knock-on effects. All right. So make sure that's correct. So how I fixed it is I put the axle with the crank disc back into the lathe, cleaned up the back surface here, cleaned up the front surface, redid the outer edge of it, and then once that was running true, so I could actually spin it here and I could see it was running true, I then put it into the mill and used an end mill to drill the crank pin hole again. And then used some thread lock and stuck it in. The back edge of it was a press fit still, but I just put some thread lock on it just to make sure that it stays in a true position. All right, so that was another gotcha that caught me. All right, so we've got that oil and popped in. Let's just put some oil on here and get this pressed in. Let's put some on there. I also put on the face. One of the things that I do while running it is I also just put oil on the top of the cylinder against that surface, that as it's moving, it kind of lubricates. As this top edge moves up and down, it pulls some of that oil onto the face. All right, so we put that there. Sorry, I need to get the piston in first before I push that in all the way. All right, so if we take the piston, one of the things that I did incorrectly with the piston is I firstly thread locked the connecting rod into the piston instead of into the crank connector. So I had to heat it up. That's why the shaft is discolored. I had to heat that up to be able to take the piston off, and then eventually just got the crank connector side thread locked. Another thing that I did is I actually, when I was waiting for the thread lock to dry on the crank connector, I assembled it as well, so that kind of that the hole in the crank connector would, again, if there was any deviation on that crank pin, it will be transferred into the crank connector. So I spun it a little bit and saw, does it move in a strange way, and make sure that it dries correctly the same way as the cylinder did. Right, so let's just get this into the cylinder. So I just put a little bit of oil in the middle here. So one of the things that Ade does recommend in the build notes is to leave the cylinder cap off. So I wasn't sure why it was kind of the last step on here, but later it made sense. Because what you want to do is you want to set this, your piston, so the thread on the piston, there should be no thread lock on there, and you can then adjust that to make sure that the piston on its highest stroke stops before your actual port on the cylinder. So you kind of set your stroke on your piston. Once all of that's correct, you take it off and then you install your cylinder cap or cylinder cover. All right, so that's one of the things that you have to do, just to make sure that your piston isn't covering the porthole. All right, so let's get that just popped on there. There we go. I don't make it super tight, but just enough that it holds everything. Okay, so then we've got the flywheel. So I did miss the flywheel. The flywheel is part of 0.5, but I thought let me get all of that kind of talked through first. Flywheel is very simple. Literally, you need to install the flywheel. The build notes recommends a 0.25 millimeter gap between your flywheel and the bearing, and then again between the bearing and the crank disc. So in total, you have about 0.5 millimeter play in there, and then you fasten it down. So I've already actually got mine fastened down and marked. So once you fasten that down, the little grub screw should mark the axle shaft. Once that's done, you file a little indentation in the axle shaft for the grub screw. So I've already done all that. I've kind of just eyed the 0.5. I know I'm probably not supposed to, but I push it up all the way. I move it back just slightly to make sure that it's not riding 100% against the bearing, and then I fasten it down. Also just move it back and forth a little bit, make sure I'm actually in that little indentation. You see there, I can feel that I'm not in the indentation properly. There it is. Okay, and that's now tightened. And there it is. And there you can actually hear it. Well, I hope you can. So you can definitely hear the air flowing or getting sucked in and blown out. Okay, last up is just the little ports. So I've just put some thread seal on, normal like plumbing thread seal on there. I think it's PTFE or something like that. Just fasten this on. Let's get it onto the air and we see how it goes. Alright, so I've just zoomed out a little bit just to show you what I'm working with. So I've just got a little 6-liter compressor that I'll be using, just with a little hand spray air nozzle on it, and then a hose just pushed onto the front of that. I literally prepped everything except a way to get the air from the compressor to the little engine. But nevertheless, this does work. I have tested it in the previous video, so it all does work. The only difference is because I've just got this little trigger, it's not easy to control the airflow, so I do set it on the compressor a bit to bring the pressure down. But yeah, it's still not perfect. But yeah, I'll look at getting some kind of like fine adjustment valves and things like that for the future. But yeah, let's just get a little bit closer to the engine and we'll start it up. Take a look. So I'm just getting it to the best position. So that's obviously its downstroke. So that's where it would start. So once the pressure comes, it'll push it down and kind of put things into motion. There we go. Difficult to keep a constant pressure. They do say the slower you can get it to run, the better it's made. I'm just adjusting it on the compressor now to see if I can get it to go slow. See how slow we can get it to run. Right, so that was the little engine running well. Here's a couple of clips of it struggling to run from the previous recording. There's definitely marks on it over there. Looks like something jammed there. There you can see the same. So that's where it's running the most, because it looks like the pivot point is a little bit skew, so it's running primarily on this corner here and there. Right, that's it for today. So my overall thoughts, I really enjoyed building the WigWag engine. You know, I personally feel really proud of what I've achieved here. It is the first WigWag Wobbler engine that I've built, and I think it came out really well. There were a couple of struggles on the way. So if I just take the cylinder and the pivot pin, that wasn't right. The axle and crank disc, that wasn't right. But the fact that I was able to fix those and actually have a well-running engine now, I think makes it even more special. And I'm really proud of what I've achieved here. But yeah, that's it for today. I would like to thank you for following me along on this journey. If you haven't watched the whole series, I'll pop a link up in the top corner. Go take a look at the making of all the parts that led up to the building. But yeah, ultimately, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, that's it for today. Overall thoughts. Alright, that's it for today. So overall thoughts, I really build for the next one. But thanks for watching. I'll leave you with this. That was anticlimactic. There we go. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one.